I want to welcome you to the 2016 Winter Webinar Series. And tonight we're going to be talking about how to kill your tree. Actually, it's more of a guide of what not to do. But, through my last few years of being with Extension, I've been accumulating lots and lots of photographs and experiences and seeing a lot of things that homeowners do that are a bit detrimental to the prolonged life of a tree. And so tonight we are going to cover some of those things. We actually do have quite a few things that we do. I didn't have time to add everything in. That's why you should have a handout that does list many more ways to kill a tree than we will cover tonight. And also on the back side of that handout are ways to not kill your tree. And then you should also have a copy of this PowerPoint to follow along. If at all you have questions at the very end, I will leave time to answer questions. Feel free to chat them into the chat box as we go along. I must say that that is yours truly. I, like many other people, we love our trees. This is the maple in our backyard, and we love the tree. Shades the backyard, keeps us nice and cool, especially during those hot times in the summer. It's also a lot of fun to just see the tree develop from, spring flowers all the way into fall color. And then also the winter interest it brings, and we hang, our bird feeders up there. But there are sometimes things people do where instead of a tree like this, we wind up with a tree like this. This is not really a tree. This is a CSI. It's a crime scene investigation. And this kicks off this first section I would like to talk about, and that is premeditation. What do I mean by premeditation? That in premeditation, we must plan out how we are going to plant our trees. So not only are we going to pick the right spot, we're also going to pick the right species. So let's look at a couple things we can premeditate to planting the right tree in the right place. The first one is water. You want to look at what type of soil moisture, what type of little microclimate you might have on your property. So as you can see the images here on the right, we have a very wet site that receives roof runoff, and then the picture below we have a very dry site that just bakes in the summer sun. There are trees that are adapted to having their feet wet, and there are trees that are adapted to dry soil. We can also look at soil itself. Now, I think many of you would agree, and we'd say look at the pH of your soil, look at your soil type, look at your soil texture. The other thing I think a lot of us deal with, though, are compacted post-construction soils. And so when we deal with post-construction soils, this is something I think we're all running into. Sorry, I'm hearing someone overhead there. Just muting people. When we deal with post-construction soils, it is a big issue. Now, the pictured here is a home, and all they did to this home is they added a sunroom. You can see it just peeking out of the backside of this house. That's all they did. Do you think they really needed to excavate all of this area here to put on this sunroof? Probably not. The big thing with construction and on tree roots is that most often we'll put construction fencing around the trunk of the tree to protect just the trunk. But really, the major damage also comes from the equipment and the materials being stored on top of the root system. We'll talk more about this later too, but when you store things or sit things on top of a root system, that can have a detrimental effect to the tree. When a contractor, if they do have to do any type of construction around a tree, we always say do it, on the outside of the drip line or the canopy line of the tree. Now, just know that even if you are doing construction outside of that area, there are still tree roots that are present there. Tree roots extend 2 to 3 times the diameter of the canopy even. And so, just keep that in mind. Instead of just putting that construction fencing around the trunk, maybe put it around the actual drip edge. And, I think the construction, team would have plenty of space to work even if the drip edge was fenced off. You also have to think about wind. Wind is a major component, especially, I don't care where you live in Illinois, northern, southern, central Illinois, we have wind here. And while, yes, this might be a little bit of an extreme example of wind, this is actually taken on the Australian outback. But, this next image here might be more of what we see. So this is a homeowner who has a home that's on a lake, and the tree is sited in the prevailing wind for this lake area. And so as you can see, this is a bald cypress, and it's well adapted to high wind. And you can see the limbs are growing upwards. They from where the wind direction is coming from. That's not the wind actually blowing it. This is a calm, still day when the picture was taken. That's just the direction the limbs are growing, almost straight up on that prevailing wind side. The bald cypress is adapted to this. It's adapted to the wet soils that's by this pond. It's also adapted to, this was a newly constructed home. So it was a very nasty red clay soil. And the tree was doing well, thriving, just came out to just make sure it was okay in terms of the wind. And so it looked good though. The other thing we have to look at is light. Now pictured here we have dogwood in both photos. And what is on the left side is a dogwood growing in the understory. And dogwoods out in nature, they are typically found in the understory or on the edge of a wooded habitat area. They do just fine, but you can see the flowering is a little bit more sparse compared to the dogwood that's grown out more in a full sun, maybe a north side of a building exposure. So lighting is important. So not only does ample light translate to better flowering, also translates to good leaf irrigation, also translates to good fall color. So lights, make sure that you are siting the whatever tree you put in the proper lighting conditions that it requires. The other thing, and this is probably the biggest one here, is space. Look at these two trees here. Now, obviously you know what's wrong here. These trees are planted way too close. They might be planted like 4 feet apart, I would say. But he's playing the piano. And they might be planted about 4 feet apart. And imagine though if these trunks get a foot diameter though as they're mature. I mean that there's not going to be much room between these two trees. Also look in the background. There's large mature trees behind them. There's trees over here to the side. There's not much space here. They're planted way too close to each other. Also, when we're dealing with space, we have to make sure we look up. This is probably one of my favorite pictures when it comes to trees and being pruned by power lines. This looks like Pac-Man is about to take a bite out of this power line right here. But this is a very common thing where folks, they plant a very large tree right underneath the power lines, not thinking about 10, 20 years down the line, what's going to happen when that power company says, well, that tree is now going to be interfering with our supply ability to the community. They're going to come in, they're going to prune it like this. This is actually not a terrible pruning job by a utility company. I've seen far, far worse. That's actually kind of neat looking. And also this picture here on the right just has me scratching my head a little bit. This tree is obviously planted way too close to the home. I would think though that as that tree grew and got tall and larger, I would think that if I had to make a choice between the home and the tree, the home would win out. But apparently the tree was more important here, and so obviously we've cut into the house to make room for the tree. I suppose that it's a very nice tree, but probably very hazardous to the home considering how close it would be. And don't forget to also look down. Many of us have our heads up looking in the canopies, but we cannot forget about the root system. These two parts of the tree are tied together. The root system, as you can see on the image of the left, this is an urban setting. It's a street tree. Well, it looks like it's just kind of growing out of the street almost. I've seen some pretty neat pictures of trees that do grow in, sidewalks and planters, but how resilient do you think this tree really is if some type of environmental, stress comes along, like a drought or a high wind? Probably not very. Looking to the tree, the image here on the right, that's a nice backyard, a nice little patio, some wooden furniture, nice place to sit, some planters, but This tree, if we think about if this was, say, a crabapple, and that's about as best I can gauge from the image here. If this was a crabapple, and this thing would grow maybe 15 to 20 feet tall and wide, how much space do you think you would need for the roots? Well, I guarantee you that planter right there is not enough. And so that's not enough root space for a tree like that. So the best thing to do when you go purchase a tree is make sure that you do your research and look at the mature plant size. So the drawings here on the top, it just shows poor plant choices, incorrect spacing. You know, that's the big problem with landscaping, is that when you install a landscape, it doesn't look finished. You know, when you build a home or when you go in and you build some type of structure, you put in that last nail, that last coat of paint, and boom, it's done. But you put in the landscape and the plants, they're little itty bitty tiny, and you know they don't look like it's done yet. So you have to make sure that you account for time in order for the landscape to mature. Otherwise, you're going to plant plants too close to the house, too close together. They're going to wind up just eating your home. You know, the image below here, it accounts for proper spacing and a proper species that could be planted next to a home, because it only matures, you know, below that roof line right there. So that's premeditation. Now let's move into a couple other things that I would say homeowners do to kill their tree. And hopefully we're learning what not to do as we go along here. The first thing we want to look at is to plant higher, not 6 feet under. Let's start with the image on the right side of the screen. This little circle diagram right here. This is what we want to see. We want to see a tree planted just as we learned how to draw it in kindergarten. You know, the trunk comes down and it flares out into the root system. We want to see that root flare right here, right at the soil line. We want to see that above the soil line. Very often what you will get is you will get trees that are planted too deep. Now, as we had mentioned before, tree roots, they grow horizontal. Despite what many of us, you know, were probably taught to believe, is that tree roots don't develop these humongous tap roots that, you know, dive into some aquifer, you know, miles beneath the ground. They actually spread out horizontally. Most tree roots can be found in the top 4 to 8 inches of the soil. And there are some species that are even more shallow rooted than that. And so if we plant our trees too deep, those roots, they're seeking the proper zone. Ideally, this is a zone with adequate oxygen and water in order to support the tree. And when we plant too deep, usually in, you know, deep, nasty subsoil, the tree roots, as you can see in the image on the top left, grow up and then out. The big issue, especially, I mean, other than the tree being planted too deep and issues with rot against the trunk, because trunks are not adapted to being planted in the soil. Roots are, but trunks are not, and neither is the root flare. The other issue we get as this trunk expands, and as these roots expand, they will grow together and they will eventually strangle each other. And the strangling or cutting off the flow of water, nutrients from the soil, and sugar, carbohydrates from the leaves, that is, by cutting that off, we call that girdling. And that will girdle the tree and could lead to its death. The other thing that happens, as I mentioned, is that a tree just simply rots off at the soil line, as we see in the bottom image right there. You know, a strong wind or even a still day, and that tree would blow over because it's just rotten at the soil line. So if it looks like a telephone pole or a lollipop sticking out of the ground, it's too deep. This next one, I call it the constrictor, and this sounds kind of like a wrestling move, but this has to do with bald and burlap trees. And with bald and burlap trees, they are typically sold, as you can see in this image here on the left. There is obviously the burlap, and then there is this wire cage that is held onto the burlap with some twine, and sometimes the burlap is also held on there with a couple nails or staples. When these are sold, and very often a nursery or a plant supplier will sell this, and they'll say, oh, just leave the wire cage and ball and burlap on. I encounter this time and again, and when homeowners plant them, they do leave these on the root ball of the tree. Now, the thing we want to make sure that we do remove this, but I want to make it clear is that the ball and the burlap is critical to protecting that root ball. The root ball needs that burlap when it's being dug out of the field and when it's being transplanted to your yard. If that burlap's not there, that root ball simply falls apart. You damage the roots, and then you wind up, giving your tree less of a chance to survive. So what we want to do is we want to keep the wire cage, everything. You want to keep that on until you get it to your yard. What I like to do with the wire cage is you can get 2 or 4 strong guys, and you can get like rock bars or some pretty sturdy broom handles, and you actually thread them in the twine. You then pick up the tree, the 2 or 4 people pick up the tree, and they carry it over to where the planting hole is, as if it's some type of ancient Egyptian goddess, and then they very carefully set it down next to the planting hole. At that point, that's when you cut away the twine and you then bend the wire basket off of the burlap. I would also say you want to loosen the burlap, take out any nails or staples that are holding it to the tree, but leave the burlap on, because you're going to need that burlap in order to pick up that root ball and place it into the planting hole. Very carefully place it into the planting hole. Once you get that into the planting hole, you will then take that burlap, and you want to remove at least the top third of the burlap, whether you fold it down or cut it off. Try to cut slits in the remaining portions of the burlap that are still on there. Burlap does degrade, does decompose, but we really need to get those tree roots out into your native soil immediately, as soon as possible. So you want to make sure that burlap's gone to not impede any type of root growth. And the picture on the right shows just what can happen when you use some type of synthetic material and you do not remove it. This is synthetic burlap planted, and this was on a sugar maple. It was planted 10 years ago, and this is 10 years after planting, and they excavate. You can see these roots, they cannot make a go of it. And the tree trunk is actually growing into the burlap. Very same scenario, I'll just add this in here, it's when you put plastic around the base of the tree. I see this a lot too, and you see the tree maybe after 10 years after it's growing, and it's starting to grow in the plastic is bulging up, and the tree starting to grow, and you can just see it starting to girdle the tree. And I love to take my knife and cut that plastic off, and I just hear the tree sigh, and it says thank you. And of course I fly away in my cape and everything. And then my kids think that's awesome, my neighbors think that's weird. So the other thing is root slasher, or really lack thereof. How plants are mostly sold, and trees and shrubs are mostly sold in the nursery, are through containers. And with containers, you do run into a high risk of getting circling roots. A circling root is something, as you can see the image on the left, there is this root here up top. You can see on the top of this root ball is just circling around and around. In a case like this would be just something very easy. You would just prune that root off. Typically when a root is circling, it's very difficult to get it to straighten out. And so what you want to do, a very good thing, is to loosen or tease any circling roots, cut them off if you can. If you do have a root ball that comes in a container, and you take the container off, as you can see in this diagram on the right side of your screen, you might even have to cut the container. It might be so root bound. If you look in there and you see lots of circling roots, and I actually often do this even if I don't, is I will score at least 4 1-inch deep vertical scores into that root ball. You do it on the cardinal directions, the north, south, east, and west side of the root ball. This, what it does is it breaks that circling root, and it hopefully initiates root growth and development at those cuts to then go out into the soil. So very important, if you see these circling roots, make sure to score your root ball. This next one I call a deadly contradiction. And it's something that actually Extension we used to recommend once upon a time. We would used to recommend that, yes, when you have a tree and you have awful clay soil, go ahead and make it nice and fluffy and put in some compost and some wonderful topsoil. Make it a really nice planting hole. Well, we've kind of gone back on that a little bit, because we found that if you make this a beautiful, perfect home, the tree roots will not want to go out into your crummy native soil. So what we say is, when you backfill the planting hole, what goes out must go back in. And the one caveat I would say, if you do have a very lousy clay soil, you can add about 5% organic matter like compost, and that would translate to maybe a 5-gallon bucket full. You just mix that in with the backfill. It's also a good idea to, in your planting area, to make that planting hole 2 to 3 times wider than the root ball itself. This just facilitates better rooting. You can amend that soil there too, about 5%, again, organic matter. But very often it's said what comes out must go back in. So backfill with native soil, please. The next one is dehydration or drowning. It is actually a very common tree killer. Too little or too much water. Obviously, as you can see in the image on the left, there is way too much water. You probably notice something else now, that the tree, it looks like a telephone pole sticking out of the ground. So, planted too deep, right? Exactly. What happens if we create these little bowls around the trunks of trees and we are able to accumulate too much water is that, again, we get rot issues, and the trunk will actually rot at that soil line. And as the image on the right, you can already surmise that that tree, it's a little too late when those those little 3 1-gallon milk jugs are just not doing the trick. The tree is obviously scorched, the leaves are dried out, they're brittle, they would crumble in your fingers. So how do we water? Well, my technique that I do prefer is some type of a drip irrigation. Depending on where you're at in the state of Illinois, you might have a clay soil. Some of you do have a sandy soil. For those with the clay soil, which that would be me, and I think a large portion of us do have clay soils. Typically, an overhead sprinkler usually applies water too quickly. You wind up getting a lot of runoff or evaporation. A drip irrigation system, is able to apply water slower at a rate that a clay soil can absorb it, and it saves water. You don't have to have a very fancy drip irrigation system that's, metered and monitored and everything. What I do actually is I just take a hose out, and I take that when it's dry and the tree does need water. Take it out, set it at the base of the tree, not up against it, but at the base, right near it, 2 to 4 feet out, I would say. You then, for a heavy clay soil, you then just you turn the water on just to a very slow drip, drip, drip. And even then, you might start to see a lot of water run off an extremely heavy clay soil. You then slow the water down as slow as possible. If you do have a more sandier soil, then maybe a very slow trickle would suffice for you. And I would let that run. If we are in some type of a drought situation for an hour, move the hose around every 15 or 20 minutes, and that should give the trunk or the tree a very good watering. And obviously, I typically only water trees when rainfall is not adequate. And so that is a great technique. A 5-gallon bucket with holes punched in the bottom of it also does work fairly well. Just move that around and you'll have to fill it up a couple of times. There is an epidemic of massive proportions, I would say, going on around North America, and that is a mulching epidemic. Somebody somewhere thought that a little mulch is good, so a lot of mulch must be great. This is actually contrary to the health of trees, though. What we see is these what you'd call mulch volcanoes. The mulches are mounded up against the trunk of the tree. Now, in nature, we have these microorganisms whose job it is to decompose this dead organic material in terms of this wood mulch and return those nutrients back to the soil and recycle that product. Now, very often, do you think that those microorganisms will distinguish between that bark mulch and that tree bark? Probably not. This is another issue. We get rot problems when we mound mulch up against trees. We also get issues with pests like voles, and that's vole with a V. Voles, they make this nice little home, and then they'll nibble around the base of that tree right there for a little snack. And so making sure that instead of doing mulch volcanoes, I want you to think of it in a different fashion. I want you to think bagel. And in terms of bagel, you have a 2 to 4 inch deep layer of mulch that is 1 to 2 inches away from the trunk of the tree. We make sure that we have a nice space here, and there's no mulch touching the trunk of the tree. Again, the depth of the mulch should be 2 to 4 inches deep. How wide should you go? Well, I would say as wide as the drip line of the tree. Now, that would be very simple, as the image here on the left is, it's probably a newly planted tree, small drip line. What do you do for large, mature shade trees? Well, I would say try to go as wide as you can. If you can make it as wide as the drip line, that's perfect. But, try to go as wide as possible. The image on the right side, as you can see, is what I tend to find in a lot of subdivisions, housing developments, is, somebody had an excess of mulch and they have just piled them up against the tree. It's not just this tree right here. There are a line of street trees on both sides of the road leading all the way down the road. Not only is, that's a waste of mulch, that's, going to shorten the lifespan of that tree. So, think bagel, not muffin. Sometimes trees can have a bad hair day, and this is usually the result of topping. Topping a tree is not a practice that is recommended. The big issue here is most of us think that we feed plants with fertilizer, but that's not the case. Fertilizer actually feeds the soil, which then the roots then take advantage of that. Plants feed themselves through photosynthesis. So if we have, in the case of this photograph here, we have two large mature shade trees, and we decide to come in and I don't know why, but we decide that we don't like how tall they are, and we top them. We have just removed the ability for these trees to produce food for themselves. They are not able to photosynthesize. They're not able to support that bulk, the trunk and the roots then below ground. All the trees, as you can see in the background, are leafed out. They're photosynthesizing. They're able to produce food. These trees cannot, and these trees then suffer for it. The other thing that this produces is weak growth. When you top a tree, the tree has a backup system. There are these latent buds that are embedded deep within the woody tissue of a tree. When a tree is topped, it signals these latent buds to begin to grow. The issue with this is that these buds are very weakly attached to the tree. So do you think the power company really is helping themselves in this situation here, topping the tree and then just leaving these suckers, these epicormic shoots, to then grow? The larger they get, the more of a hazard they'll be to the power lines because of that weak attachment to the tree. They're also more susceptible to pests. So don't top your tree. Even if professionals do that, don't do it. How do we prune a tree? Well, first thing you want to do if you want to make a cut along the trunk is you want to look for the branch collar. The branch collar is this swollen area. It's right below and it's below the branch, but right against the trunk. You also might see a branch bark ridge, which is on the top of the branch, and this is raised area. You want to make sure that you're making your cuts outside of this, because another thing that we think that trees heal, they don't actually heal. They seal off any wounds. When you go out into a forest and you walk around, have you ever thought about, why is all the growth in that top 1/3 and the bottom 2/3, there's nothing there? How did that happen? Well, as that tree grew and those lower limbs became shaded out, that those bottom branches, if they're not able to photosynthesize and support the tree because of a low amount of sunlight, the tree then cuts off, flow of nutrients to that branch, and it, in essence, kills that branch. The cells in that branch collar are specialized to then seal off that branch. Over time, that branch then decays, that area is sealed off, and the branch simply just falls off into the woods. There's not an army of squirrels out there that are, they have their lumberjack hats and hatchets and they're, taking care of that. It's the trees doing that all themselves. So even if it's a dead branch or if it's a living branch, we want to make sure that we make our cuts on the outside of that branch collar. It could be a large branch, like on the left side. It could be a small branch that we'd be using a hand pruner on. We'd still look for that swollen base, and we'd make our cut outside of that. Now, how exactly should we make our cuts? And I really do recommend the 3-cut technique. And this is something I actually this is illustrating a larger limb, um, but I have had to use this for limbs like, you know, a half inch in diameter or sometimes even less. The big issue here is if we make our first cut, right outside the branch collar, we'll start at the top of the branch with our saw and we'll make our way down. The weight of the limb will eventually swing that limb down. And when it swings down, a big issue is that it then swings down and tears the trunk of the tree, that healthy tissue on the trunk of the tree. And that's damaging the tree is something we do not want to happen. So in order to prevent this, we use the 3-cut technique. Our first cut, we go through the bottom third, a little bit out from where we'll make that final cut. We'll go, a foot or so away from that, cut up the bottom third of the trunk, of the branch. Our second cut is just on the outside of the first cut, and that is to take off the branch. So even if the branch swings down, that first cut will prevent it from tearing back in and damaging the trunk. The third cut is then to just remove that little part of stub. And as I said, I've had to use this even for very small limbs, because even with small limbs, if you're using a saw on them, they will also swing down and on like a thin barked tree. I've torn those trunks many times, and so I've started using 3-cut technique. Hit and run mowers. Lawnmower disease is not an actual disease, but it is something that plant pathologists have coined for a very common issue dealing with trees, and that's when we go out on our riding mowers or string trimmers and we're playing bumper cars out there with our trees. A little bit of tree anatomy here is that the plant tissue, the xylem and the phloem that moves water nutrients up, and then our carbohydrates down into the root system, is right behind the bark of the tree. The bark is protecting that tissue. When we go by with our mower or string trimmer and we cut into that, when we damage that bark and we cut into that tissue, we are severing that flow of nutrients in the tree. And we really want to avoid that, because we will eventually wind up, if you do this time and again, you will wind up girdling. Sometimes I've seen the entire trunk of the tree, and then the tree then succumbs and it dies. So make sure, again, a good mulch ring will prevent this. It will keep mowers away. If you do see weeds growing up against the trunk of the tree, please you'll have to bend down and pull them by hand. That's the best way to avoid damaging a tree. So please mow responsibly. The next thing is it's kind of sad. It's kind of a common occurrence. I call this, this is my homage to Clue. It was the homeowner in the backyard with the poison. This was a site call I went out to. A homeowner had put in a windbreak. As you can see, it's a very nice windbreak. And a few years after they had put it in, they started to see their spruces begin to look like this, as you can see in the picture. So I'm looking at the spruces, and it does look like herbicide damage. Now, this is bordering, you can see in the background, a cornfield, and so you might be thinking, well, could it be some type of a drift from the commercial ag? But the white pine were fine, and everything else seemed to be doing okay. I then looked down at my feet. Do you see how immaculate this lawn is? So I asked the homeowner, I said, your lawn is perfect. What are you spraying on it to make it this way? He then goes in and brings out the product that he was spraying on there, and it was this. And you probably can't read it on your screen, so I'll read it for you. So the product is for the control of broadleaf, annual, and perennial weeds and certain woody species on CRP, rangeland, and permanent grass pastures. Doesn't say lawn anywhere. The active ingredients in this are actually picloram and 2,4-D. Both are broadleaf herbicides, and picloram also is fairly mobile in soil. So these two herbicides are broadleaf herbicides. What is a tree? It's a broadleaf. When we spray on their lawn, we can also inadvertently affect the broadleaf trees that are growing within our lawn. So make sure, please, please, when you are applying any type of a pesticide, and for us, a pesticide is anything that controls any type of pest, whether it's a weed, an insect, or a disease, make sure that you read the label. Please, please read the label so that this does not happen. It's a very common occurrence. This is what the blue spruce, what they look like. He called me out. Wanted me to come see the trees again late this past summer, and the white pines started to succumb. So what we determined is that the blue spruce were more susceptible and began to show symptoms earlier on. And then it was not until later on in the year that then the white pine then also began to exhibit symptoms of accidental herbicide application. And as I said, this is common. This is another photograph from another site visit I did, another misapplication of a pesticide where they wanted to spray their fruit trees, but they used the wrong thing. They mixed it incorrectly. And they wound up killing the trees, the grass, some landscape plantings in the background. So always, always, always read your product labels. They are federal law, and if you do not adhere to them, you are breaking federal law. So very important lesson. There's also some bad medicine out there, and honestly, one of the things Extension also used to recommend, but we do not anymore, and that is the use of wound sealers. Now, this is a tree that had developed some, sun scorch, some cracking on the southwest side of the tree. The homeowner then came in and applied the wound sealer, hoping that might facilitate something better. So that's not some type of weird disease on the bark. That's actually the tar that you paint on a wound. So even in this situation, or even if you're removing a limb from a tree, we do not recommend painting that wound sealer on the trees. Actually, they do just a great enough, fine enough job on their own without us sealing off any type of pathogen, on that wound. So wound sealing, don't use it. We also, same homeowner here, he had filled in some concrete and some other cavities of trees, and that is another thing that you do not want to do. The major thing that why you don't want to do that is that concrete and wood are two different physical materials that have their own properties of expansion and contraction, and in the hot and cold, concrete and wood expand and contract differently, and you will probably wind up just doing a lot of damage to the trunk of the tree. So do not put concrete in the cavity hollow of a tree. There's always the absent-minded homeowner, and sometimes I'm guilty of this myself, but this is a situation. I was given a phone call from a homeowner, and he had a hackberry, and it was doing very poorly. He said the top was just dying back. He couldn't explain it, and over the phone, I honestly couldn't either. Hackberries are a fairly tough and durable landscape tree, and so I decided the only way for me to determine what was going on here is probably go out and see for myself. So I went out and did a site visit here, and as I walked up to the tree, I immediately saw all of this growth coming up from the base of the tree. And I knew something was probably going on around the soil line if that was the case. The other thing I then noticed as we pull back this growth, and as we also cut it back, as you can see there are pruning cuts here, is that there is a tomato cage around the tree. Didn't appear there overnight. The homeowner had actually put that tomato cage there to help protect and support it when he had first planted it. He had then just forgotten about it. Now, tomato cages typically have 3 rings going around it. As you can see, the first bottom ring is already completely engulfed by the trunk of the tree. The second ring is very present on the outside of the trunk right here, but that first ring there is what is girdling that tree. It is what is likely going to kill that tree. I have seen trees rebound from some pretty significant trauma, but this is pretty big. But the homeowner, he wanted to make a go of it. He wanted to see if he could help the tree limp it along and see if it would survive. So what we did in this case, he took some wire cutters, cut off the cage. We then had a discussion. Should he dig out the loop that's already in there? And I decided that that's probably not a good idea to go in and damage that tissue all over again. So hopefully that tree will just simply keep growing as normal, but it was already very stressed and very unlikely that the tree will have a normal lifespan, probably a very shortened lifespan. So we have talked in depth about a lot of things not to do, and here's another thing, how to not plant a tree. The first thing that that we didn't cover is not to prune the tree right after you plant it. You sometimes this is another recommendation given, but we want to avoid pruning the tree in that first year of planting. Now you do want to remove any dead, damaged, broken, any limbs that might be rubbing against each other. You want to remove those at planting, but then leave the tree, let it be, allow it to focus on establishing its root system, and it'll need some leaf matter for that. Make sure also, this is another big issue, is the tree wrapping. You can wrap a tree, that's perfectly fine, and that is actually a good practice for thin barked trees and newly planted trees, especially if you have deer in your area. You can wrap it in the fall, but make sure you remove it before springtime. What happens is that if homeowners forget to remove that wrapping is the tree trunk expands very quickly in the spring, and after the course of a year or two, that tree wrapping can then constrict the trunk and you can wind up girdling your tree again. I've also seen the situation where black field tile was placed as the tree wrap around the trunk of the tree. I'm sure it worked great in the wintertime, but when I went out to visit a very sickly tree, it was during our 2012 drought. It was about 105 degrees that day, and when I lifted up the black field tile, the trunk was baking from that tile, just absorbing sunlight and then radiating heat. There was sap oozing out of the trunk of the tree. So make sure we remove that tree wrap um, in spring pronto. The other big issue is staking your tree. Now, what I see for most trees, most landscape trees, is you do not have to stake them. There are some things, container grown trees might require very loose staking. Um, uh, but you don't want to be tying your tree down so that it can't run away, because, well, it's not going to. The big thing you want to avoid is you do not want the root ball to be able to move too much, which would inhibit root establishment in the soil. But you want to allow that tree to sway in the wind to build up taper and a resistance to the wind. The other big issue is make sure that where you put your stake is not in the root ball itself. There's actually no type of stability gained from this. So how should we plant a tree? Well, this is a diagram that I really like for how to correctly prune the tree. We just do a little light pruning to remove any dead or damaged limbs, protect that trunk in the wintertime, but take it off at springtime. Very loosely tied nylon or pantyhose worked well. I learned that today. Pantyhose does work well as a tree stake tie. Make sure that stake is out in your soil. The tree is not planted too deep. That the mulch is 2 to 4 inches thick, 1 to 2 inches away from the trunk. That burlap, the cage is removed, and that burlap is rolled down at least a third of the way and cut slits in the existing burlap for root establishment. So that I see that as the best way and the best image to plant a tree. But I also want to leave you with this image here. Some things homeowners do to their trees can be scary. So don't let this happen to your tree. And now you know what not to do. This is my contact information. I'll come back to this slide here. If you want to view this session again or past sessions, we post our recorded 4 seasons on YouTube. Our YouTube channel is University of Illinois Extension Horticulture. Please subscribe to that. We update that frequently with our new 4 Seasons webinars. And I am happy. I've spoke for about 45 minutes, and we have 15 minutes here remaining in an hour for questions. I'm happy to take questions right now. Very good, Paul. Does a tree make a sound in the woods when it falls? I guess that depends on who's there to listen, but I would say yes, it does. I'm sure it made a sound. First question coming up here is what is the best way to remove suckers from a tree? Now, there is, uh, just to backtrack here a bit, there are trees that are just notorious for suckering. The old-fashioned crab apples are one of those. Clethra is or willows. These are trees that sucker. Um, but if you want to remove them, the best way I find, if they're small and young enough, you just you know use your hand, twist them off. Otherwise, it's using just a simple hand pruner, cut down as low as you can. Um, and typically with suckers, depending on the species, it's just part of the chore that comes along with owning the plant. The next question from Petty: is there any remedy for a tree planted too deep? I would say probably not. Um, if you plant a tree too deep, there has been some talk where you can excavate that soil down until you find the root flare. The big problem, and this is may not be an issue with folks with sandy soil, but the big problem is if you have a clay soil that does not drain well, and that little bowl or basin you've just dug around the root, the trunk of the tree will collect water. Not You'll get rot issues from the water, but then if, say, in the wintertime, the colder seasons of the year, that water freezes, it will expand and it will damage the trunk. If it's a newly planted tree, I'm talking like a year maybe, that's pushing it. But if you planted it like last month, then yeah, you can probably dig it back up, and plant it higher. Make sure you pack down the soil beneath the root ball because it will settle over time, and you might just wind up getting the same results. Um, for established trees that are planted too deep, um, that's really a tough one. I don't have any good remedies for a tree planted too deep, other than if you can potentially regrade your yard. Next question. We lost the tops of several large trees in an ice storm early this year. Anything we can do for these trees? One of the trees whose tops we lost was a bald cypress. Oh, that's too bad. Bald cypress have that beautiful, conical or pyramidal shape to them, and when you lose that central leader, it kind of breaks that all up. I would say in this situation, you really need to have a certified arborist come out, inspect those trees. They'll probably need some type of corrective pruning, and they will be able to help you with that. To locate a certified arborist, what I do recommend is you go to the International Society of Arboriculture's website. That is actually just, if you would Google ISA and arborist, you just Google that. They have a locate an arborist, and you just type in your zip code, and it will bring up a list of nearby certified arborists. The Illinois Association of Arborists also have a website, and you can use the Find Arborist feature with that as well. The one thing I would recommend, though, is that if you do go to the yellow pages, and you're looking for tree trimmers, to make sure that they give you proof of insurance before they even start working. Um, but obviously, ideally we would recommend a certified arborist come out to inspect and prune your trees. Let's see. I recently read an article that was not in favor of cabling trees. What is my opinion? Um, Cabling trees, I don't know enough of the research to give a good or bad, or to give a favorable or displeasing commentary on cabling. That is something certainly that needs to be discussed with a certified arborist once again, because it is a very specialized type of tree care. For very valuable trees, very high-end specimen trees, perhaps cabling would be a good option. Um, if you have 200 trees on your property and this tree is just another one of those trees and you're thinking about cabling, then I would not opt for that. Lynn asks, what recommendations do you have for planting bare root seedling trees? As far as recommendations for those go, you have to be very careful with them. This would be the time of year that you would probably be ordering them, receiving them. If you do receive them at this time of year, you want to make sure to keep them cold, put them in the refrigerator, because you want to avoid keep them from sprouting, from the buds from opening. You have to be very careful with the roots. Do not let them dry out before you get them in the ground. The planting hole is a little bit different. You will once again, though, be wanting to plant the tree a little bit higher, making sure that you identify where that root flare is going to develop, and make sure that the soil line is there. Splay the roots out in the planting hole so that they fan out and you won't get any circling roots. But bare root trees, that's the way to go, especially if you have lots of trees to plant. Thank you, Jenny. Jenny just posted in the chat box the website to the ISA Arborist website. All right. Well, if nobody else has any questions, or if you'd like to email me your question or give me a call, please feel free to do so. I've gone back a few slides. My email address is listed at the bottom here, along with phone number. And please feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email if you have questions. And I do appreciate and thank everyone for joining us tonight, and have a great night.